presenter today is Dr. Karina Vernon, and the topic is Black Farmers and Black Farms Matter, the history of Black farming on the Canadian prairies, 1872 to 1920. In the popular imagination, agriculture is often seen as a site of oppression and exploitation of Black people. However, Karina Vernon's talk will reveal agriculture as an important but under-celebrated site of resistance and freedom for Black people in Canada. By looking at examples of particular Black farmers in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, their histories of migration, and their literary and oral cultures, this talk will reveal how farms provided the ground for Black sovereignty, collective agency, and community resilience in Canada. Finally, this talk will consider how the important memory of Black freedom farms are being kept alive in the present through story and song. Karina Vernon is an associate professor at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, where she researches and teaches in the areas of Canadian and Black Canadian literature, Black aesthetics, archives, critical pedagogy, and Black Indigenous solidarities. She is editor of the Black Prairie Archives, an anthology released in 2020. The book publishes for the first time writing that ranges from work by 19th century Black fur traders and pioneers to contemporary writing of the 21st century. These writings enrich our understanding of Black Canada by bringing to light the prairies, Black histories, cultures, and presence. She will soon publish a companion volume, Critical Readings in the Black Prairie Archives. Please go ahead, Karina.
Thank you, Kathy, for that lovely introduction. And I want to extend a warm hello to everybody who has joined this webinar. I'm really heartened by the robust turnout today and from all over Canada and the globe as well. I saw that someone popped in from Nigeria. This is really cool. I'm pleased to know about the work of your organization. And I respect the mission of the NFU, and so it's really an honor to be in conversation with you today. I'd like to thank you for the invitation to share my research, and I'd also like to thank all the people behind the scenes that make an event like this possible, with its simultaneous translation, recording, and everything like that. These events don't come off without a lot of work, so I'd like to thank everybody for the labor that they've put in to making this talk possible today. Kathy mentioned that the book that I published in 2020, the Black Prairie Archives. And so I would like to just tell you briefly what that project is about, what the seeds of that project were, and then let you know that I'll be presenting material out of that book. So I grew up on the prairies in Calgary, and then a small community north of Calgary called Olds. Some of you folks may have been through that part of the world. Growing up there was pretty tough in a lot of ways. For a Black mixed race kid, I didn't see too many signs in my environment that revealed that the place, that geography, had in fact been the site of several important waves of Black migration to the prairies, and that in fact my family was part of this lineage. So I kept that, I carried that as a question for a really long time. And my book, The Black Prairie Archives, is kind of my answer to the question about what Blackness is and means on the Canadian prairies. So as Kathy mentioned, it includes oral literature, archival writing, early writing, and gathers together an archive between two book covers. And so I'd like to present some material out of that book today. May I have the second slide, please? Oh yeah, there's the title, and there's a cover image of my book. If we could move actually to the third slide. Although in this presentation, I'm going to focus on the region of the prairies, which is the region on which I focus my research. And I'm going to focus specifically on the time period of 1872 to 1920. I want to begin by gesturing toward the broader history of Black farms and farmers in the Americas and Canada, because this history is a really old one. It goes back at least 500 years. We know that enslaved people kept kitchen and market gardens, which they tended after the labor that was extracted from them was done. The form of labor that went into these provision gardens was their own, and thus represented a strategy of resistance and an important system of food security. Along with that, gardens tended by enslaved peoples sustained memory of their living connection to Africa. As Monica M. White reveals in her books, Freedom Farms, African people smuggled seeds, roots, vegetables, and other produce with them across the Middle Passage. Women hid rice by braiding the seeds into their hair. African yams, arrowroot, bananas, various kinds of beans, cowpeas, squash, okra, pearl millet, pigeon peas, plantain, sesame, sweet potatoes, taro, and watermelon are just some of the foods introduced to the Americas and the Caribbean via the Middle Passage. In Canada, the story of farming as a form of resistance to slavery includes the history of the Black Loyalists. May I have the next slide, please? Thank you. During the American Revolutionary War, thousands of free and enslaved people fought on the side of Britain, who promised the Loyalists, quote, freedom and a farm, for fighting on the British side against the Americans. The promise of freedom and a farm, as the Philipsburg Declaration put it in 1779, was a really powerful incentive. It's estimated that 20,000 African Americans joined the British side, while tellingly, only 5,000 joined the American side. On this slide, you'll see two images commemorating the Black Loyalists. The first is an illustration of a loyalist named Richard Pierpoint by painter Malcolm Jones. The painting is housed in the Canadian War Museum. The second image on the slide is a watercolor painting titled Bedford Basin by Robert Petley. It was painted in 1835, and it depicts a family of Black Loyalists in Nova Scotia. If you've ever been to the Bedford Basin, you might recognize that terrain. In popular media, such as films, novels, and histories, Black people's experience of agriculture is often represented as a story of subjugation, hardship, and danger. Agricultural and rural settings have been repeatedly linked to painful memories, memories of slavery, tenant farming, and sharecropping. These processes have driven a deep wedge between Black people and the land. Today, the relation of Black peoples to land remains a fraught one. And our relation to land becomes even more complicated when we consider, as we must, the history of colonialism that displaced Indigenous peoples from their lands at the same time as Black people's labor was stolen to work these lands. Black Canadian poet Marlene Norbisi Phillip puts the problem succinctly in her essay titled Echoes in a Stranger Land. She writes, "How could we, meaning Black folks, how could we begin to love the land when even the land was unfree?" Without diminishing any part of this complex history that entwines Black and Indigenous peoples with the land, I'd like to offer here another story, one in which Black farms are recovered as important sites of resistance, self-sufficiency, and freedom. I hope that in relating this counter story, I'm able to offer a more fulsome picture of what Black life and spaces of freedom have looked like in Canada and what they may look like also in the future. I know that your organization, many members are working to rebuild sustainable food systems and ensure food security. And this is, I think, particularly important for Black communities. So I'm hoping that we'll have a chance to connect historical struggles for sustainable Black communities and food security with present and future struggles. In this presentation, we will see the role that farms and farming played in the development of viable, self-sustaining, all Black communities on the prairies in the early part of the 20th century. Farms have been important keys to unlocking Black freedom. Farms have been powerful sites where Black people have reconnected with the land and with other than human beings. Farms have sustained us and our communities, even though we are not Indigenous to these particular lands. As scholar and activist Robin Maynard puts it, we are people of many lands, more lands than we can count. While we are not Indigenous here, what we find on the prairies are stories that reveal how Black people have been important caretakers of the land too, something that is often erased in our current conversations about farming and environmental conservation. These are stories that we must insist on and insist on passing on too, because they help us to remember that our relationship to the land is not only a story of oppression, but also a story of reconnection, healing, cooperation, and liberation. In this presentation, I offer 5 short vignettes about different farmers who worked prairie land between 1872 and 1920. I conclude with a song sung by the descendants of Black farmers, which keeps memory of Black farmers alive and part of the present. What I'm able to offer in this presentation is, of course, far from a complete history of Black farms and Black farming, but I hope it's enough to give you a sense of the important roles that farms played in the freedom struggles of Black people in Canada. Before I turn to these vignettes, let me offer a quick note on terminology. Farmers in this presentation refers to all those who work the land, regardless of their land ownership status. Some farmers, like Daniel Williams, who I'll talk about, were regarded as illegal squatters, although he saw himself as a rightful occupant. Others that I will talk about, like Luther Gerard, Rosa Shannon, and Lloyd Mays, became landowners or were descendants of farmers who held title to the land they tended. Black in this presentation encompasses a range of African-descended people, including mixed race and Afro-Indigenous people. Finally, prairie land in this presentation is always understood as Indigenous land, belonging to Cree, Blackfoot, Nakota, and Métis nations. Yet Black people on these lands are not settlers. They are, to use Anthony Morgan's term, displanted people who, in the aftermaths of the transatlantic slave trade, landed or were planted in Indigenous peoples' territories. And they put the land in relation to their global networks of the Black diasporic world. Yes, I'm on the right slide there, thank you. The story of Black farmers on the prairies begins with a figure named Daniel Williams, a farmer who homesteaded in the Peace River district in what is today known as northwestern Alberta. I've got a map here on the slide, and if you just look at the map of Alberta, you can see running north to southwest is the Peace River. And this is the country around which Daniel Williams homesteaded. Daniel Williams is an important figure in our story for many reasons. As a literature scholar, Williams matters a great deal to me because his 1872 diary is the oldest surviving piece of writing that I have found by a Black author on the Canadian prairies. A selection from Williams' diary was preserved because it was printed in a seemingly unlikely source, a government document titled Province of Manitoba and Northwest Territory of the Dominion of Canada, Information for Emigrants. What was Daniel Williams writing about in his diary that would be important enough to be published by a press in Ottawa? The name of the publisher gives it away. It was published by the Department of Agriculture in Ottawa. Williams' diary was a farming journal. In it, he kept careful track of the climate of the Peace District, its frosts, snows, and melts, and he kept careful track of when he planted and harvested. Could I have the next slide, please? Beautiful. On the left-hand side is the title page of the Department of Agriculture book in which Daniel Williams' journal entry appears. And on the right, you've got a fragment from Dan Williams' journal. You will see that I've redacted a word there at the top because we don't need to see this kind of nickname that he was called at the time and which they entered into this book. But let me just read, let's read together maybe a fragment of Daniel Williams' diary. 1872, ice began to run in the river, November 8th. River closed, November 28th. First snow, October 28th. And so on. He records when the ice moved out of the river, when he planted potatoes, when the first permanent snow arrived, and when the river closed year after year. This is the diary he kept. One of the things that I want to do, but haven't had a chance to do yet with this journal, is to check it against current climate patterns. Williams' diary might be an important source for tracing changing weather patterns due to anthropogenic climate change in the Peace River District. So who was Dan Williams, the author of these agricultural journals? And what was he doing so far north and west? What we know of Dan Williams' early life is that he was born in Canada, in Kingston, in what was then called Canada West and what we currently call Ontario. He probably traveled west overland as a translator and cook for the famous John Palliser expedition, which surveyed the prairies from 1857 to 1860 for possible routes for the Canadian Pacific Railway. By 1872, as we see in his journal though, he was well established in the Peace River District. But as is so often the case, Williams' presence and his belonging in the Peace River District was contested. The Hudson's Bay Company thought he was an illegal occupant and characterized him, they wrote about him as a, quote, idler and squatter on what they thought was their land. Williams wrote a strongly worded letter to a Hudson's Bay Company worker, they were called factors, a factor named Kennedy. And this strongly worded letter it also survives because it was printed along with his diary entries. And the letter is important and really powerful because in this letter, Williams claims the land as his premises. May I have the next slide, please? Okay, I've got the text of this short letter that Dan William wrote to the Hudson's Bay Company who regarded him as an illegal squatter. Yeah, and he wrote this letter on April 12th, 1873. He wrote, Kennedy, I hereby warn you that come and get your personal property, if any you have got on my premises, in 24 hours, and then keep away from me, because I shall not be troubled nor trod on, only by her most noble majesty, government, signed D.T. Williams. And then on the reverse side of the letter, Dan Williams wrote, I have waited long a day for an answer from that notice you tore down, and now it is my turn to tore down. Clearly, for Williams, farming was a form of resistance. He was there before the Hudson's Bay Company arrived, and his crop of potatoes, barley, and oats formed a kind of living evidence of his being and belonging there. In farming the land, William planted more than potatoes and barley and oats. He effectively planted himself in that Peace District soil. The second farmer that I'd like to feature in this presentation is named Luther Gerard. Thanks for the slide change there. His oral testimony is included in my book. Luther Gerard and his family were a part of what we call the Oklahoma migration to the Canadian prairies. And I think there might be members of the audience whose ancestors were also part of this migration. So just to give you a sense of this migration in a nutshell, it has kind of two parts, a history that happened in the United States and things that were happening at the same time across the border in Canada. So in the US, during the transition from slavery to Reconstruction, this tumultuous period known as Reconstruction after emancipation in 1863, many Black communities formed what were known as settlement towns. They were also called by other names, freedom villages, freedmen's settlements, or freedom colonies. These were intentional communities built up to resist the exploitative conditions of sharecropping and tenant farming. And so what they would do is settle on land that was regarded as unclaimed, so to speak. And on that unclaimed land, they built up successful family farms and communities, often all Black communities. And this was to a large extent the case of what was then called Indian Territory, and which later became the state of Oklahoma in 1907. So on this slide, you can see all these towns established before 1880. And these were some of the freedom towns. As an Indian territory, I should explain, as an Indian territory, at the time, it didn't have the same segregation legislation that other American states had. So Black folks found this kind of area where they could live untouched by those segregation laws, grandfather clauses, and other things that limited their political freedom, and where they could be in contact with land. And land is so key to establishing economic independence. And so this is what they did in Oklahoma before the coming of statehood, as I said, in 1907. But when it became a state, that segregation legislation came in, Black folks were denied the vote, the Ku Klux Klan became active in the area, and all of this left many Black families and communities landless and in extreme conditions of financial, social, and political oppression. So Black farmers were looking around, where can we go um, to reestablish ourselves? They looked to Mexico, they looked to other parts of the world. At the same time as this was happening in Oklahoma, the Canadian government was actively trying to recruit American farmers to come north and settle on land that they had recently expropriated from Indigenous people, Indigenous nations. This was in the wake of the signing of the numbered treaties. And so the Canadian government was advertising all over the US that farmers could come and take up 160 acres of land for a filing fee of $10, with a stipulation that they had to clear the land and live on it, build a um, permanent house, and fence it and so forth. And so Black farmers answered the call. Could I have the next slide, please? Here on this slide, I've got an example of the kind of advertisement that the Canadian government ran in American newspapers. The ads accidentally got run in a number of newspapers that circulated in Black and mixed race communities in the US. The Canadian government, never intended Black farmers to come north, but they thought they were invited because they saw these advertisements. And this call came just at the moment where Black Oklahomans were becoming dispossessed once again. Could I have the next slide, please? Okay, on this slide, I've got a map of Alberta with some of the locations indicating where Black farmers went in Canada. I don't have a map here of Saskatchewan, but they also went to locations in Saskatchewan, in the Maidstone and Rosetown districts of Saskatchewan. But here you'll see Amber Valley in the north of Edmonton, Wildwood to the west of Edmonton, Edson, Breton in the south of Alberta, Dutchess and Vulcan. Some of you may have heard the name Amber Valley in the past. Amber Valley is kind of famous because it is the largest all Black community ever to exist in the world, sort of as far north as it is. And it was the largest all Black community to ever exist west of Ontario. When I look at this map, I have this complex mix of emotions because I see how far the farmers were both willing to go and had to go to find a place in the world where they could build up a community, build up a self-sustaining community. So you see that this kind of ring, maybe horseshoe ring around Edmonton, they deliberately sought distance from white settlements, but also proximity to railroad stations so that they could be mobile. So even that geography tells us a lot about the story. Land would be really important, and figuring out an economy in which Black farmers could be self-sustaining was crucial to this period of the Black freedom struggle. So I'd like to turn, oh yes, also on this slide, let me mention, you can see this stamp that was recently released, this Canadian postage stamp. Depicted are some of the first arrivals to Amber Valley. The very first one is that gentleman on the left named Harry Sneed. Along with him are Jordan W. Murphy with his great-granddaughter, Bernice Bowen, and granddaughter, Vivian Murphy Harris. And on the far right there Amy Brodie, who was a midwife. So let me tell you a little bit about our next farmer, Luther Gerard, who arrived with his family on the prairies during this period of migration. He was part of the Oklahoma migration. And I'd like to just read an excerpt for you from the anthology, which collects some of his oral history. So this is his oral history in his own words, which have been transcribed and included here. So Luther Gerard says, well, my parents and grandparents were sharecroppers. They worked for some big landowner, you know? He'd sublet his land out to them and they'd plant crops. They raised potatoes back in Oklahoma. They used to sell carloads of potatoes. That's one thing my father tried to do once he got out here. But he didn't go in that big. He just sold to camps. Our folks came in October 1912, and all the land in this area was homesteaded. You couldn't get homesteads close. The only place they could find was 4 miles northeast of Wildwood. Most of the people in Wildwood were colored. There were a few Germans and Scandinavians, but mostly colored people were in this area. At that time, at the time when they came, they were putting the railway through, and that was the first work that my dad had to do. My dad had got to do. There were no roads when they came in here. There were just trails through the bush. These trails had to be cleared just so you could get through by a team and wagon. Just that's all there was. And you take in the summertime, it was pretty near impossible to get in with a team and wagon to town to get your groceries because there were potholes and mires and you'd get your horses down in. It took a whole day to come 3 or 4 miles with an empty wagon and team. Luther Gerard also talks in his oral history about the cooperatives that Black farmers started. So he says, it seems to me that the people in Junkins formed a kind of co-op. Say 10 or 15 farmers would go together and they would sign up for government cattle. They would get up to $500 worth of cattle. That was around 15 or 20 head at the time. So there are quite a few stories of Black farmers saying that they started different kinds of cooperatives. The farms gave farmers the opportunities to achieve a kind of economic emancipation. Black farmers of this period tell many stories about the trust economies they developed. So these are economies sort of beyond trading federal currency. They built houses cooperatively. They raised barns together as a community. They worked together to establish churches. They established their own community schools, their own community infrastructure. So emancipation for Black farmers of this period meant, in many ways, freedom from the wage system. Luther Gerard tells us there was no money paid out. They'd exchange work, and the work was always done. Trading labor in this way, making sure that you kept your word, you gave your labor when you traded for it, also drew the community closer together. I should say also that I know that rural communities rely on each other in ways that are quite special, having grown up in rural places myself, and having friends that lived in the country. I know that rural people rely on one another. But I think that Black farmers were very intentional about the trust economy and kind of developing these experiments in radical underground economic systems or trade, bartering trade, trust economies. Um, One of the pastors of the church in Edmonton, one of the Black pastors, um, when he was in the US, he published a pamphlet called Why I Became a Socialist. And so this was kind of the political spirit in the air around these communities. Black folks were so often on the sharp edge of, of capitalism, of the wage system. And so part of their emancipation struggle was to try to find different ways to live together and different ways of supporting one another. And as I say, the farms provided the economic basis for these alternative economies. Um, as we survey the history of Black farming on the prairies, it's important to include the stories of women. Women also forged intimate relationships with the land, and they farmed and foraged with the land that they farmed and foraged on. And they left compelling records that offer reader access to their inner worlds. They tell us what it feels like to farm. They tell us in detailed accounts what the land meant to them. Rosa Shannon is the name of a farmer that I'd like to spotlight too. Her family took up a homestead near what was then called Junkins and is now known as Wildwood, Alberta. It's west of Edmonton, and their family went out to that homestead around 1908. In this excerpt that I'm going to read from her oral testimony, she describes how her family went out to their homestead near Chip Lake. And what I find special about her words is her description of her family's foodways. They had deep ecological knowledge about how to live with the land, what to plant, when to plant, how to hunt, how to forage. And because of their ecological wisdom and knowledge, the land sustained them. So let me read from Rosa Shannon's account. Let me see. Before they built their permanent house on their homestead, Rosa Shannon says that we lived in an old trapper's cabin until winter thaw up, until breakup. When that thaw came in the spring, Mom, Dad, and the boys went out to the homestead and built a house up there. In the spring, we hunted for fresh meat, deer, wild pheasants, rabbit, bear, anything you wanted in the wild meat was there. Ducks and geese just swarmed the lakes. You could just go down there and rake up feathers by the bagful. This was in the summer when they were getting ready to put on their fall feathers, getting ready for the winter again. We used to hunt them, but we didn't have to go far because they fly right overhead. Let's see.
Just a time check, Karina. You've got 10 minutes.
Oh my goodness, time is going past really quickly. Okay, let me just read this paragraph from Rosa Shannon before I move on. She ends her oral testimony with this. No one knows this, yes. This is why sometimes I cry in my heart. I just love it out here. I love my people, but the memory of it hurts because we gave our lives to this part of the country. I would like to see something done here, put up at Wildwood, to honor the old timers, the old pioneers. I thought of a drinking fountain, an old black face, red face, white face drinking fountain. The fountain could be there for that purpose, and they could turn it on at certain times in the summer. Um, Okay, with my 9 minutes remaining, I'm wondering what to hit next. I wanted to spotlight one more farmer, and maybe I'll just spotlight him quickly. Um, and this is for the folks. Um, this is for the folks who have um, connection to the Saskatchewan places where the Oklahoman arrivants uh, came. Um, I wanted to share a few sentences from Lloyd May's oral history that I've included in this book. Um, okay, just from the beginning of Lloyd May's oral history. The memories of my boyhood on the farm in Saskatchewan are happy ones. I have fond recollections of wading in sloughs and prowling the woods to raid the nests of owls, hawks, crows, and magpies. Each summer, I would have the young of those birds for pets. The nicest bird I remember having for a pet was a blue jay. Um, this oral history is just rich with details of this really effective bond between a boy growing up on a farm and those other than human beings on the farm, rabbits, gophers, grouse, you know, that, they hunted, but they also had this intimate relationship with. The last sentences of Lloyd Mays's oral story, oral reflection of his boyhood on the farm in southwest Saskatchewan recollect him getting in a car and driving away west from the family homestead in Saskatchewan. And, you know, he drove away he says, in 1941. And in a way, those all Black communities that were built by their parents and grandparents only lasted as such as these kind of experiments in Black community and experiments in alternative economies. They lasted one or two generations. The irony is that the strength of these all Black communities in some ways depended on, their distance from white communities. But as times changed and the culture changed, the children and grandchildren of those folks who homesteaded there began to find their place in cities, right? They started to integrate with the wider society. And so their existence as all Black communities began to disappear around the 40s, 50s, and 60s. I see Lisa Mays saying in the chat that in Maidstone there's one farm and you treasure it. Absolutely, absolutely. Those places are so special as repositories of Black history and memory, and part of that huge, big story of the struggle for freedom in these Americas. Those are very, very special places. They really should be preserved. They really should be preserved as national historic sites of importance. Anyway, so those farms really sort of weren't given to the next generation. The profession of farming wasn't passed on in maybe the way that we might have wanted to see it passed on. And so the result is that we don't have as many Black farmers in this generation as we should and as we need. And the result is food insecurity, right? Living here in Toronto, the price of food is just, unbelievable. And folks shop at the dollar store, and no frill. And there's a lot of food insecurity. And that reconnection with the land is an absolutely vital part of the full meaning of the word emancipation. So I respect the work that your organization is doing in supporting the current generation of farms to live sustainably, and also to balance that history of reconnection with the land with decolonial imperatives. So I wanted to end by playing a song sung by, there we go, Janetta Jamerson and her group called, they're called the Black Pioneer Heritage Singers. And these are folks who are descended of the Oklahoma migration to the prairies of 1905 to 1912. And they're currently living around Edmonton. So let me just introduce the song with a few framing remarks, and then I'll let the song play my presentation out. So what you're going to hear is a traditional gospel song called "Keep Your Hand on the Plow." And I think in many ways, this song brings my presentation around full circle, back to the Black loyalists and their quest for freedom and a farm. "Keep Your Hand on the Plow" is a song that goes back to the 1910s. And it's a song that the singer's ancestors brought with them across the border and onto their farms. I see Lisa Mays is asking. The group of singers is called the Black Pioneer Heritage Singers. So the allusion to the plow in this song makes reference to the agricultural work that Black folks took on in slavery and after. And the spiritual is a message of encouragement to keep going, right? Keep your hand on the plow. It has religious connotations too. To keep plowing means to be fit for the kingdom of God. In the context of our conversation about Black farmers and the work of the NFU, we can also hear it as encouragement to reclaim farming practices and to see rural spaces as Black spaces. To keep your hand on the plow is to continue to do the work toward building sustainable communities and food sovereignty. So with that, let's play Janetta Jamerson and the Pioneer Heritage Singers, "Keep Your Hand on the Plow."
Hey, Karina, I don't think we can hear it. At least I can't.
Okay.
Actually,
When you
if
hit share screen, sorry, when you hit share screen, there'll be you have to unshare and then reshare. And in the dialog box on the bottom left, there's a check mark that says share computer sounds. So you'll click that and then that should fix it for you.
Bless you. This next one, I think you got the gist by now. We were sort of rural people, kind of country folk. This next song we want to bless you with is "Keep Your Hand on the Plow." Come on, y'all, let's put your hands together. Hold on, hold on, hold on, hold on. Keep your hand on the plow. Hold on, For when my way gets dark at night, I know